Hey everybody, I see people starting to filter into the webinar. I'm going to just give it a minute and then we'll get started. All right, so welcome everyone. We've got people filtering in now, and I'm sure more will join us as this gets rolling. I am John Duda. I'm one of the worker owners at RedMS, which you can see behind me. If, like me, you've spent a lot of time in this space, looking at an image like this is really, it's strange, right? Seeing people together, like gathering, having a good time because they're, able to collectively articulate a political vision in the same space and not be afraid of contaminating each other is, it's remarkable how much we've lost in such a short time. And I think it's something that really, at least for us, has challenged our kind of understanding of the political valence of the situation, right? How do we, as a project that was designed to really create a space for people to come together, continue to do things when coming together is exactly the thing you're not allowed to do? So we've been, this is our first experiment with a virtual book talk, but we've also been trying to do some other things as well. Some, direct service survival activities like helping Tubman House in West Baltimore with food donations, but also trying to do some organizing and just some fun to keep people connected and keep building community here in Baltimore. I will say that we definitely need the support of people who loved our space or who had just found our space or have known our space for years. It's, we're a worker-owned cooperative. We don't have deep pockets. Our entire business model is really built around the synergies of people coming together and gathering and then having to spend money while they're there. So, we haven't been able to really pivot to takeout. We haven't really honestly felt comfortable pivoting to takeout because we don't, as a workplace democracy, it's hard to get a vote on let's, engage ourselves for, making an extra buck, right? So we've been trying to do what we've been doing in very, very careful ways that really take our workers' safety very, very seriously. We are still selling books, so that's one way you can support us in this time. In fact, I will put in the chat right now a link to the book we're going to be talking about tonight, Applied It to Win, Why We Need the Green New Deal. You can buy it from us. We'll ship it out to you. We have a worker cooperative support fund that we've been organizing, which you can find if you go to our website, redms.org. That's one we've been working with a kind of nationwide network to kind of create a solidarity fund, because we know that, everybody's applied for this government aid, but nobody's gotten a penny of this yet. And, it's going to be really, really rough to keep a project going, to keep a normal small business going, let alone one that's committed to radical values like we are. So I thank everybody for their support, and I thank Daniel and Thea for joining us tonight virtually. Daniel, I think, is joining us from Philadelphia, where he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. Thea is joining us, I think, from Providence, where she teaches at the University of Providence.
Providence College.
Oh, okay. College. And both of them are two of the four co-authors of this really exciting book that came out at the end of last year, Applied It to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. They also do a whole bunch of other stuff. Thea is involved with the Eco-Socialist Caucus of DSA. Daniel is a senior fellow at Data for Progress. They're both extremely busy on numerous fronts. I know Thea has another book coming out soon on extractivism and the global south, particularly Latin America. And then I think just a bit at the center of a knot of really, really interesting thinkers who have been kind of providing some of the content and vision for the upsurge in interest in socialist visions that we've seen continuing to grow, and which will no doubt continue to grow as this crisis continues and deepens. So I'm really excited to welcome them here tonight to talk about their book, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you. Maybe before we get right into the book, I thought Thea and I might just share for a couple minutes how we've been keeping connected politically, because hearing you lay that out, John. First of all, I hope everybody does buy books from Red Emma's. However, you can do that and support the Worker Co-op Fund. Red Emma's is such a great institution. I've had family who's lived in Baltimore and loved it, and I was very lucky to get to give a talk there many months ago. So it's beautiful to see it again on the screen, and a bit heartbreaking to be missing the chance to be there physically, but hopefully we'll get back there soon. I'll say more in a minute about this, but Thea, I'm curious to hear how you've been coping with the challenges that John laid out in terms of the, this is a moment of political organizing and solidarity, and yet we can't be in the same room as each other, which is normally part of what keeps us going during disasters.
Yeah, well, thanks for that great question, and thanks, John, for the intros. A lot of my political work in the past couple of years, as John mentioned, has been in the Eco-Socialist Working Group in DSA, and a lot of that work has revolved around sort of articulating principles of an eco-socialist Green New Deal and advocating within the organization to kind of prioritize Green New Deal work and climate work in general. And all of that organizing, well, not all of it, but a lot of that organizing took place virtually anyway, because all of us are dispersed across different chapters in the organization. And so we had our meetings via Zoom for the past several years, regardless. And a lot of the work that we do in terms of engaging members around issues of climate justice and the Green New Deal and energy democracy is internal educational work. So we hosted like Zoom sessions that 100 people would be on and learning about the nitty-gritty of how to organize an energy democracy campaign. So like on our end, a lot of the organizing is similar. A lot of focus on education, on messaging, on providing digital toolkits for social media and things like that. The issue is that like that's meant to prompt like organizing that involves direct action, that involves canvassing, that involves showing up at a PUC hearing and actually giving testimony and things like that. And that sort of embodied form of activism is obviously not possible now, though I do think that there are interesting ways, interesting ideas that a lot of organizers have that are floating around out there in terms of how to still make use of sort of visible public space while obviously respecting and heeding by the protocols of social distancing. So, we could talk more about that later, but yeah, in terms of my activism, I feel like it's not that different, but it's again more like the activism isn't leading to some of the same types of actions in terms of local chapters that it might have been in the past. So still figuring that out.
I hear you, and I think in some ways similar for me. Although being in Philly, there's quite a bit going on, and it's just difficult not to be face to face. So why don't we get in here and talk a little bit about the book? I think we keep this conversation about the activism going. Certainly a large part of my own organizing, like especially around housing issues. I mean, not being able to go and visit people in their homes. I spent a lot of time in New York public housing in the lead up to the Green New Deal for NYCHA and for public housing legislation. I don't know, it's hard. And I think this is maybe something we can talk about some more together. So let's get to the book. I have a copy next to me here, very professionally. Just picture me with John's background, flashing my book, late night TV styles. So I think I want to say a few words about the Green New Deal in a sort of big picture sense, and then a couple things about some of the specific elements that we try to bring to it in the book, and then Thea will say some more. And I want to say at the outset that we're in a crisis. Obviously, everybody knows that. We're in a climate emergency, and that's not stopped. And I think that COVID feels and is completely overwhelming right now. But we also unfortunately are about to see the two, I think, collide. We are looking at a spring of wildfire season in California, for example, where the lack of ability to put people out to do controlled wildfires will mean even more smoke in the lungs of people who are also being attacked by COVID. We're looking at a third of the country vulnerable to the kind of flooding we saw in the Midwest last year. Meteorologists are warning about a particularly vicious hurricane season. All these disasters will strike in a context where it's, sending people outside is going to be very difficult and will risk revitalizing the pandemic. And we're already seeing this around the world. We saw in Ecuador historic flooding in indigenous communities where the government was reluctant to send in aid workers for fear of spreading the pandemic. We've seen a cyclone just smash into Vanuatu in Fiji, and in Fiji there is a number of known COVID cases. And so this is raising a lot of hard questions. And of course, the other piece that is probably common sense for anybody on this call already is that the eco-apartheid that basically characterizes 21st century capitalism means that wildly disproportionately numbers of Black and brown people are dying from this disease. And those are the same communities that are hit first and hardest by climate change. So I think it is, although it is hard sometimes to sort of step out of the everyday news and say, we need a climate plan. Actually, we're just a few days away, even in the United States, from those two things colliding. And we really need to, I think, have our heads primed as socialists and as organizers to think, okay, how can we now tackle these problems' root causes? So the Green New Deal, I think, remains the best option on the table by far for tackling the root causes of these problems, the inequalities and the carbon pollution, and even to some extent the relationships between human and animals that cause pandemics. I don't know how much we'll talk about food today. It's not our specialty, but we could get into it. The core ideas of the Green New Deal, as presented by AOC and Ed Markey in their resolution a little over a year ago, were, I would say, four big ideas. One, unprecedented public mobilization to spend, trillions and trillions of dollars, up to 16 in Bernie's version, to do it essentially whatever it takes to get carbon emissions to zero extremely quickly, including to about zero in the energy sector by around 2030. Second, jobs guarantee. That's very important. Black and brown workers are excluded by the labor market from good jobs, in fact, often from jobs at all, especially Black Americans. The third idea is universal social services, healthcare, education, childcare. These things should be free and should be available to everybody. And I'm actually old enough to remember when all these ideas seemed radical. The idea of spending trillions of dollars in economic stimulus was considered like, trillion was the forbidden word during the Obama stimulus 2008, 2009. The idea of guaranteeing jobs. Oh, hello, unemployment is at 3.5%. Why does anybody need a jobs program? Well, now it's up, we have had something like 15 million have filed for unemployment, more than that. And of course, universal healthcare. And then the fourth big idea is direct investment in frontline communities. That's central to the Green New Deal idea. I think it's the most original idea in climate politics of the last few years. And it's been, you've seen this already in California with very successful policies, and we can do more and better. I think that what our book brings to this very strong set of ideas in a big picture sense is a few more things. One is we really lean into a short-term vision. We're not talking about zero carbon emissions by 2024, but we want to talk about policies and organizing projects that will immediately bear fruit. Talking about things like getting electric buses, building energy retrofits, taking public ownership of utilities in the context of 1, 2, or 3 years. No more procrastinating, no more using 2050 as a way to essentially say nothing about the present and push off everything beyond the cycle of current politics. We want to be short-term and concrete, and we want to get focus on winning, winning things and building strength as we win, getting stronger and stronger and stronger with inspiration from people like the labor leader, Jane McAlevey, showing how you can revitalize a moribund union in 1 or 2 years. And then the final big idea is that it's not just that we want this fight to be from below, which of course we do, but we want to completely move beyond a concept of environmental austerity and move towards something more like public luxury. And to do that in the context of climate change, to dematerialize what public luxury looks like. So we want to use far fewer resources and live a lot better. The very rich are not going to live quite as well as they do now, unfortunately for them. If they want foie gras, they can go make it themselves. But we will live quite a bit better. So let me just say a word each about 2 of the chapters in the book that I think exemplify this. The first is the idea of green jobs. We have a strong argument that we need green jobs. Of course, we need jobs in energy construction, making green buses, clean buses, electric buses, you name it. But we also want to say that the fundamental thing that we're trying to do here is create a world that doesn't cause carbon emissions, that's safer, and then live in it. And that means that the kind of climate work that we're talking about is not just green manufacturing, but it's also care work. It's teaching, it's nursing, it's taking care of people, taking care of ecosystems, like the, mind going blank here, the CCC. So people taking care of ecosystems. And the point there is this sort of shift away from a thing we have now, which is where we work very hard just to get by, but other people work very hard and make a lot of money and buy crap that we don't need, and we work many, many hours. And what we want to do is instead have free social services, education, healthcare, childcare, you name it, that make it possible for us to work many fewer hours a week, spend more time with the people we love, doing things that we like doing, leisure, fun, sports, arts, crafts, you name it. That's kind of the vision. And so that means that we're trying to re-envision green work away from narrowly just building clean electricity towards the kind of world of taking care of each other and taking care of the earth. And there's some interesting precedents we could get into, including the Black freedom struggle, which many people don't know, but Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King were strong advocates of both a jobs guarantee and universal basic income. So that everybody had the option to to go to work, but that option was not the only way that you could live. And indeed that, this work would not devour your entire life or the search for it, but would simply be one component of a broad, rich life that would make everybody free. And then the second quick thing I'll say about this idea of dematerializing prosperity and making it available to everyone is we talk a lot about the energy system, the housing system, the transportation system, public recreation. Well, I'll just focus right now on housing for a minute. We sort of point out that tens of millions of people are going to have to move around because of extreme weather in the United States. We hope that tens of millions of immigrants will be welcomed in the United States in the decades to come. And a lot of that will be because of climate change that's too late to stop. And we need to build places, cities, towns, reservations. We need to build spaces in which we can live and live well, and that this is not destroying the planet. And so to do that, we talk about a massive increase of social housing, building on the best models that we can see around the world. Social housing that does not cause any carbon emissions because it uses renewable energy and in fact, very little energy. Social housing that we use to decarbonize the building industry. So we're using no carbon cement instead of carbon rich cement, recycled steel, this sort of thing. And that we're also kind of creating a new sort of spatial relationship to the world around us. So that these new temples of public luxury, like the best public housing in Vienna, for instance, has in its own complexes, things like theater spaces, dental clinics, childcare spaces, and so on. And in fact, become resiliency centers and community centers for the entire neighborhood. So I could go on and on and on. Thea will talk more in a second. I hope that in the conversation that comes, we can really think about of all the different things we can do to build a Green New Deal, of all the things we can do to live better and in a climate-friendly way, what are the projects we can start in the very short term to fight COVID as well, to put people back to work, meet the needs of this political moment, and at the same time advance the longer-term agenda that we need. So Thea, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Thank you. I'm going to say a little bit more about a couple of other chapters of the book and do my best to make some connections to COVID and the sort of current crisis and the ways that that current crisis will intersect with the climate crisis and very shortly, as Daniel already laid out. One of the big differences between the sort of Green New Deal paradigm of climate politics and a sort of older variant of climate politics is that, in the past, there was this kind of notion like, we are all equally responsible for climate change because everything that we do as individuals has climate impacts. Therefore, the goal of public policy should be to modify our individual behavior, and we should also do that as consumers and our individual consumption choices. And the best way to do that is to have like a carbon tax or carbon price that kind of incentivizes us to consume differently. And this is sort of a market-oriented, incremental, and also austerity framework, kind of echoing what Daniel said earlier, that that's also potentially regressive in terms of like who's actually footing the bill for fighting climate change. And so what's so inspiring about the Green New Deal and all the politics that are sort of proliferating around it is that it's much more clearly like a class politics and a politics of collective action and a politics of public investment that's progressive and equitable. So one piece of that Daniel kind of already mentioned in talking about labor is that, you know, we imagine that the protagonist of the Green New Deal, and this is already coming into being, is a sort of multiracial working class, and there's the ones that are going to be fighting for it. But the sort of flip side of that is that the Green New Deal, to some degree in the resolution, but I think even more so in the politics around the Green New Deal that have kind of proliferated since then, is that we need to name who our enemies are, right? So it's not just about like who are the protagonists, but it's also like where are we aiming our public policies and also our anger about climate politics. And so what we do kind of at the outset of the book is just name that the fossil fuel industry is our class enemy, and actually even get specific about like the executives of the fossil fuel industries who have directly profited from planetary destruction, have blood on their hands, and should be held responsible for that, right? So it's like very clear, like there are specific firms, sectors, and actually individuals in the world that are like, yes, more responsible than your average person, and certainly like factors of a million more responsible than like a low-income person in the global south is, right? Like there's no way to equate those two levels of responsibility for climate change. And, you know, I think that the benefit of this, both, you know, I think it's analytically correct, it's empirically correct, that some people in firms and classes are more responsible than others. But it also is much more mobilizing and inspiring to have that kind of clarity around like who benefits from the current system and who pays the cost for it, rather than this kind of prior version of climate politics in which we're all a little bit responsible, but that's not very inspiring in order to kind of take action. So, and I don't want to go off of too much of a tangent, but I do think that there's some parallels with COVID, and this is actually a point that Daniel made that I'm just going to copy from him because I think it's super smart, that like there is this idea that these public health crises, whether COVID or other ones in the past, like are like an equalizer, like they affect everyone equally because like a ruling class person could get COVID and a poor person could get COVID. But that's like a total mystification, because yes, while it's true that like epidemiologically the virus can end up anywhere, it's not true that it affects all people in the same way. If you're in a social position where you don't have access to healthcare, where you have pre-existing conditions that are due to poverty, whatever it is, we could go down the list. Like it's not an equalizer. It's actually the opposite. And climate change is the same, right? It actually exacerbates social inequalities rather than sort of papering them over. So I think we can think about this with this sort of general kind of class politics framework with COVID as well, and also think about like who are our class enemies with COVID. Like, you know, maybe it's the private insurance industry or the pharmaceutical industry or the way that medical supplies are controlled by a few firms, or, you know, we can think about sort of parallels, but I don't want to deviate too much from the book, but I think that there's kind of some resonances there. And so just back to the fossil fuel piece, righteous rage is great, but we also have like a goal with this rage, which is we need to dismantle the fossil fuel industry, right? It is just a threat to the planet and it's a threat to human health. We completely agree with the climate justice, kind of keep it in the ground approach, that we need to not just regulate people's consumption of fossil fuels, but actually stop extraction at the source. And so we talk a bit about how that might be done with a few different policy tools, but just to put it really broadly, I think the main takeaway from our analysis there is that we can't trust the same fossil fuel executives that got us into this mess to get us out of it. So we need to actually exert public and democratic control over the fossil fuel sector and also over our utility and electricity kind of sectors in order to shepherd them through a just transition and a transition to renewable energy, right? So this looks like nationalizing the fossil fuel sector and phasing it out. It looks like public ownership over our energy grids as well. And so those are some of the policies that we put forth there. And actually they're resonating. Since we wrote the book, I've seen a lot more proposals around nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. And also a lot of campaigns have sprung up around demanding public ownership of our utilities, a lot of which are in private hands right now. And I'll just bring up one other sort of section of the book that we haven't talked about yet, which I think is kind of relates in an interesting way to the question of fossil fuels and how to dismantle fossil capitalism, which is thinking about climate politics from an internationalist in terms of the sort of leftist value of solidarity kind of perspective. And one of the things that we were wary of in sort of our advocacy for a transition to renewable energy is making sure that our sort of the policies that we put in place to kind of carry us through a transition to renewable energy don't replicate some of the worst aspects of fossil capitalism. And it might seem odd to say that because certainly we're going to not replicate like all the contamination that fossil fuel extraction causes and all the death and destruction that climate change causes. But there are other aspects of fossil capitalism that could easily be replicated in a sort of renewable energy regime. And those elements have to do with the deeply unequal political economy of our planet, right? In terms of the way that economic relationships between countries are kind of deeply rooted in colonial relationships that are 500 years old, right? And this could very easily be replicated with renewable energy replacing fossil fuels. And so what we kind of look at is something that folks on the call may already be aware of, or maybe not, because it's actually not something that's discussed much in the climate politic kind of discourse, which is all of the natural resources, raw materials that come from the earth that would be required for a renewable energy transition. And if you just take, for example, an electric vehicle, you know, in many ways, an electric vehicle is better than an internal combustion engine vehicle. It doesn't combust energy and then like pollute the air everywhere that it goes. But in other ways, it's not better, right? So an electric vehicle requires a lot of mined materials from the earth, a tremendous amount of copper, and also lithium and cobalt and nickel and magnesium, and I could go on. And for various reasons, technical reasons that I won't get into, it requires a lot more mined material than a traditional car does. And so this raises the question immediately of like, where's that stuff gonna come from, under what conditions, and will the ways in which we extract in order to produce green technologies, whether they're electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, lithium batteries, will those replicate and perhaps even exacerbate some of the inequalities and forms of domination that already mark our kind of global economy? And so we kind of look into I would say these are among the thorniest kind of dilemmas of the energy transition, and we make some proposals around green and just trade regimes to replace our free trade regime, and how that might address some of the problems specifically with lithium extraction. It's kind of like a case study, but we could apply it to other sectors. And specifically with lithium, a lot of it comes from South America. A lot of it comes from really vulnerable ecosystems that are even made more vulnerable by climate change, and in areas where a lot of indigenous people live who are already marginalized and have seen their rights kind of trampled by foreign companies of all sorts. And so we're going to propose a trade regime to replace the so-called free trade regime with one that is fair and just, and sort of takes as its point of departure the respect for example, indigenous communities to say no to extraction if they don't want it to happen, or to shape the terms under which extraction takes place, and also to protect the rights of workers at all nodes of the supply chain. And then to sort of just, this is my kind of last point here, and connect it back to COVID a little bit. Another thing that we propose is just kind of bring back the principles of internationalism and solidarity on the left in the US, and kind of always make the point that capitalism is planetary in scale, and our politics and our commitments and values should also be planetary in scale. And I think those are words that we say a lot on the left these days, but even within my own lifetime, a couple of decades of being an activist on the left, I've actually seen less like transnational and solidarity and sort of global work than there was even like a decade ago. So I think that we've kind of lost some of the habits of building transnational solidarity and being internationally oriented in our organizing. And it can feel super hard to do that in moments of crisis, like we're really just attending to our immediate needs, our households, our neighborhoods, our communities. But I think that, you know, just in just as I was saying a little bit earlier, like COVID is going to be extremely unequal in the devastation it causes. And that will be no less apparent when we take sort of the global into view and look at how it's devastating already people throughout the global South. So I think just like keeping that in mind in whatever form that takes to inform our politics and our response to COVID is super important. But I'll close it out there, and looking forward to questions.
All right. So thank you both for that really quick, really eloquent kind of summary of some really big themes in a really important book. So the way Q&A is going to work, I have a few questions as a moderator that I'm going to pose and give you all on the chat a chance to think up some good questions while I'm doing that. When you do have a question, you should have like a raise your hand button. And you can use that if you do that, I can turn your video on when it's time for you to ask your question, and then I'll just leave your video on and you can all just hang out. We're taking a little bit of precautions because there's been a rash of like Zoom bombing bullshit that we don't really want to mess with tonight. So, and if you really don't want to turn your video on, like, I don't know, you're not dressed or something, you're watching this from bed and just don't want to deal with it. There's also a Q&A button that you can use to type in a question, but that would be far less fun.
John, I gotta say that reminds me of a Kids in the Hall skit. I don't know if any of you ever watched this, where they're talking about this guy has made all this coffee naked and then they don't want to drink it. And it turns out, he does like everything naked. And everybody's like basically losing their mind. And now I'm just thinking about that. These people with their not screen showing, just talk, naked, like, Green New Deal.
All right, so I have three questions for you both. And the first one is, I think, it's one that I don't know if people have fully processed what the changed calculus around the exit, or at least the suspension of the Bernie Sanders campaign is. And not just in an immediate kind of tactical sense, but I think back to when this book was released, there was a credible chance that a candidate powered by a grassroots socialist mobilization was going to take the Democratic nomination for the presidency and then win the election against Donald Trump, right? So there's a sort of structural feeling that goes along with that, where you feel, I think where revolutionary demands and policy demands can coincide quite neatly, right? Because you have, for once in a blue moon, you have this, coincidence of credible candidate for for the highest political office in the land with the demands of a rising socialist movement. Really exciting. Made a lot of people feel really optimistic. It's kind of over. And I guess, what does that do to the demands here? And I'm thinking about, Biden with his, honestly pathetic crumbs that he started throwing to the left, like $10,000 of mean-tested student loan forgiveness, lowering the Medicare age by 5 years, right? Like totally missing the point of the whole systemic critique of the medical system that's unfolding right before our eyes at this very moment, with so many millions of people losing their health insurance. And I'm just wondering, like, what does it do to the way we organize when we're looking best case scenario, a Biden administration that's open to some concessions to the left? And specifically, like, what is the role of extra parliamentary, to use a fancy word, but I don't know the equivalent for the US context where we don't have a parliament, but what is the sort of role of, the not pushing policymakers, but really pushing systemic demands? And I'm thinking about the New Deal context where, people weren't organizing for a New Deal, right? The New Deal was the compromise they got because people wanted to overthrow the entire system, right? And we threaded a needle through that with a turn towards something like social democracy. So I know that's a huge question with lots of facets and all of that, but I'm curious to know your take on it.
I can start. I'm ready. Thinking about this 24/7. Yeah, I love the phrase you use, structure of feelings. Like in the week after Nevada, I felt very good. And I don't feel that good anymore. But I think it is essential for socialists to not back down from national politics. I think that's very, very important. So some things that I think are the same. Whether Bernie had won or lost, or rather, even if Bernie had won, the problem was going to be, well, who's going to write the damn bills? Actually, literally, like there's only 4 people in the squad. And the best that you get in the Senate is Elizabeth Warren. And, we know what that's like now. So I think one of the things that Thea and I have done in the wake of Bernie's campaign sort of faltering, and now he's out, but we, along with 9 other people, co-authored a letter to Congress calling for a green stimulus. So a bunch of policies, most of which completely consistent with the Green New Deal, but, basically saying, okay, it's not just that we want to have a menu of policy options. That's great. But we also need to start talking to Congress, I think, and to making demands, not just to our friends, which is like the, say, Squad Plus, Squad, Chuy Garcia, Pramila, but we also, there's the Climate Crisis Committee. I mean, there's a number of senators and reps in the House that if Bernie was going to get his laws through, they would have had to champion them. And we're not going to have Bernie, but we'll have Biden. But actually, Biden doesn't get a vote in the Senate or the House either. So I think as socialists, we have arrived in national politics. Now we do have to train our fire on the Congress as well. And you could list any number of different ways of doing that. But obviously, one of the most effective is the primary threat that the right has mobilized. But we also know it's not the only one. I mean, I don't think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the champion that she is right now without constant pressure from the left just to maintain her own prestige in the movement. I mean, if the left doesn't like her anymore, she doesn't really matter that much politically. So I think that there is like an ongoing electoral engagement, the primary process, this Congress. There was always going to be the problem of 2024. Like, I think we should occupy the White House. Why the hell not? Everybody under 50 years old, which is half a century, basically our program has more appeal than any other one. So that is also like an electoral horizon. And then the last thing is, extra parliamentary. That's exactly right. And the Senate does have a parliamentary officer. So I guess we can keep saying extra parliamentary. I think a huge amount of what Thea and I have thought about, and Alyssa Battistoni and Kate Aronoff, and hopefully we'll talk about more tonight, especially tonight, what are the lessons from the 08-09 crash and recovery? And one of them is that Obama gets elected with a fine, usual Democratic presidential platform, some bullet points that we would have enjoyed. And what happens, there was nobody in the streets. I mean, I went to the Wall Street protest, literally on Wall Street, protesting TARP. There were like 2,500 people there. I mean, it was the ultimate usual suspects at that time. That's essentially nothing. You were entering into a phase that was gonna have 10 million foreclosures, very predictable, mass unemployment at a level not yet seen since the Great Depression. Now it's worse, but then it was extremely bad. And you had no one in the streets. And in that context, what Obama did was he signed up to be the continuity candidate with W on the TARP, on the bailout of the very big banks. And then, as we describe in our book, he said to bank executives very early in 2009, he said, I'm the only one standing between you and the pitchforks. And we say we should actually have constructed solar-powered pitchfork factories and had a left populist green jobs program then, instead of hiding the stimulus, not putting any green jobs in it, and making it about maintaining executive pay, which was a fucking disaster. So on the fundamental question, and this goes back to the New Deal as well, when FDR ran for president promising a 25% budget cut. People don't remember that. Then as now with Biden, the squad, it doesn't matter. Like what's coming is a huge austerity to counterbalance the current relief efforts. And the only way that we get stimulus instead is with massive pressure in the streets, revitalizing labor movements, community groups, and so on. So I think that is all the bread and butter of the left. I guess what I'm saying, to add a bit of novelty, is make specific stimulus demands, demand them of Congress, and don't just stop at our friends in the squad. We have to push bigger, much bigger. And in the context of the economy falling to pieces, who knows what we'll get. But no electoral politics as a substitute for extra parliamentary action. At the same time, giving up on the primary process and hacking the party. I don't know why we would do that either.
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly depressed after Bernie suspended his campaign, and I mean, depressed well before that in terms of the sort of centrist consolidation with the obvious intention of sort of sidelining his campaign, and all that sucks. But I mean, I think though, like, I just couldn't agree more with everything Daniel said, and I'm not even sure I have so much more to add to it. I mean, I guess that just a couple of things, just to reiterate that last point, like, we know that, like, battles over the stimulus, over economic recovery, over budget austerity, potentially as a very kind of expected would be an unsurprising sort of next kind of way to counterbalance the the recovery efforts, like we know that all of these are coming, they're already in motion, and we just have to see that as like the next sort of train of class struggle and be very clear about what our demands are, very bold about them, and uncompromising at the same time that we use a multiplicity of tactics, you know, whether it's electoral work, working with our allies in Congress, whether it's not the usual forms of extra parliamentary protest in terms of the social distancing stuff, but obviously forms of independent, external, and militant pressure. And we need to do all of that because we just like literally cannot afford to stop for 1 second. I mean, I don't want to shame people who need like a second to sort of mourn over the campaign or are obviously very involved in their own immediate needs and their families and communities. But for anyone that can, you just pick yourself up and you just deal with it, because we have a climate crisis, the clock is ticking, we have a public health crisis, and we have an extremely organized right wing and also extremely organized, apparently, and super disciplined centrist establishment. Like, who knew they were so fucking disciplined until they wanted to get a socialist out of the race, right? So like, our enemies are extremely organized, they're in close contact, they're networked, and they already know what they're doing policy-wise. They are gonna just do enough stimulus to sort of like say that they tried, and then they're gonna like roll it all back really, really, really in very cruel ways as soon as they can, right? And we know a couple of other things, which is that a lot of Americans, like the majority of like young Americans, I'm just gonna say that, I don't know if it's true, but like a lot of young Americans, and actually a lot of just like voters in general, support us on the policy issues. I mean, like the entire sidelining of Bernie had nothing to do with like his policies being unpopular. I read this ridiculous thing in the New York Times that was their sort of like post-mortem, and like the first thing was like, oh, voters decided that Bernie was too left-wing. Like, voters never fucking decided that. There was never a referendum on whether Bernie was too left-wing. What there was like a sort of culture of like fear around electability that was like pushed very clearly through the centrist establishment and the media establishment, and people understandably responded to that because of how much they hate Trump with going with a sort of safe choice. But exit poll after exit poll shows that actually our policies are really popular. So we have a crisis situation in terms of the budget politics, the public health politics, the climate politics. We just like have to be as bold as possible because our enemies are being as bold as possible, and they're using every tactic in the book, and we need to do that also. And just last thing, just to sort of reiterate, but add a little bit to this point about Bernie not being the person in the White House. FDR was no radical. And like, also if we like zoom out globally and like, let's say take Latin America, a place that Daniel and I have worked on in terms of both scholarship and activism for a long time. Some of the pink tie governments that like we now think of as like radical socialists were actually not that radical when they came into power. Like Chavez did not call himself a socialist for the first several years that he was in office, and he was pushed to do so by an amazing sort of upswelling of popular but like independent from him forms of street politics and of protest politics and of demand making. And he was pushed to identify as a socialist and to push through, I'm not going to get into what's become of Venezuela, but like to push through extremely progressive public policies at the time, right? And so we never take for granted that either like a leftist coming to power is enough, but nor do we accept that like if a leftist doesn't come to power that we can't get left-wing policies pushed through. Like history shows us that like we shouldn't think either of those things, and we should just always take the context that's given to us and demand the most that is possible, and a little bit more than the most that is possible within that context.
Thank you. Those are both really thoughtful answers. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A because I'm really just anxious to see some other people. So my other question is, I want to ask about this link between, I think both of you kind of mentioned that, the right-wing response is going to be austerity as soon as they can manage it. And I think one of the things that I've been like terrified of for certainly since November 2016 is that the right would figure out the repressive right, the right that is interested in, maintaining white supremacy, interested in really clamping down on forms of dissent and forms of social dissonance that it doesn't like, would figure out that austerity wasn't the way to go, right? That austerity was a losing hand. And, Trump, to his discredit, has not figured this out. I think, the right now we're looking at the post office dying and being cut up into pieces to be sold off, maybe, or maybe we just won't even have the ability to mail things anymore, sometime in the next couple of weeks. So they're still playing by that rule book, but there's rumblings of people like Josh Hawley, who honestly just terrifies me, who was to the left of most Democrats on payroll replacement, proposing something more like a Denmark-style payroll replacement program. Happily, Jayapal kind of came in and one-upped him and said we should have 100% payroll replacement. Maybe that happened kind of simultaneously, but I wonder about what it looks like as we continue to fight these things if the right pivots, and if the right pivots away from this, what we've known since the neoliberal turn as a certain kind of austerity and a certain kind of repressive tendency going hand in hand, to something that's maybe a little more spendy and a little more dangerous, and especially as these responses to these crises start to become something they have to be offering, a response to. So
yeah, I completely agree that would be terrifying, and I also agree with some of what you were saying there in terms of the fact that this would be terrifying, but it also hasn't happened yet in the U.S. I think what's interesting about comparing the U.S. to Western, Eastern, and Central Europe is that type of Herrenvolk sort of social democracy has very much been articulated in the European context, but it hasn't been articulated in the U.S. context aside from certain figures. I mean, obviously Steve Bannon is the first one that comes to mind, who completely supports forms of a welfare state and is critical of free trade and X, Y, and Z, and infuse some of that into Trump's electoral campaign and messaging. But the minute Trump is in office, and there are ways in which Trump departs from the neoliberal center for sure. But it turns out that on economic policies, he has barely budged from the GOP, the sort of GOP playbook of the past few decades. And I agree that he would actually be an even scarier political force if he were to stitch together a sort of white supremacist, xenophobic politics with policies that actually address the material needs of the working class. But he can't do so because whether a combination of his own just deeply rooted pro-business ideology, which is central to who he is and his whole family, or if it's just the political weight and pressure of his economic advisors, of his donors, of all the whole class milieu in which he is in, is so antithetical to even the barest forms of social welfare provisioning. And I think that it is amazing that despite all of his campaign rhetoric, he has just hewed even more to the line of neoliberal austerity and cruelty than even some of his predecessors did. And so I actually don't think we have that to fear, because and we could get into why it is that has emerged in Europe and it hasn't emerged in the US. And I have some hypotheses there, but I don't want to go too off track. But I don't think we're going to see that form of right-wing populism beyond rhetoric in the US, because the Republican Party is just too tied to ruling class interests. And the ruling class interests are, I guess in theory, it could be in their interest to provide some social welfare to make social reproduction function a little bit better than it does, but whatever, they don't seem to have that kind of form of rational class interest. They're much more just extremely rapacious, rentier, parasitic, let's just extract the most profit possible on this burning planet before, and we can just pass it on to our kids. That just seems to be their class politics. So I don't think we have that to fear, but I will just say one last thing and then see if Daniel wants to add anything, which is that the fact that these extremely minimal forms of social provisioning that were part of the stimulus measure kind of did in a way outflank the Democratic Party is just a statement on the Democratic Party more than anything else. I think it's more of a statement of the leadership of the Democratic Party for sort of allowing themselves to be outflanked both simultaneously on the right and the left by Republicans than it says about the likelihood of Herrenvolk social democracy. But I'm hoping that with increased pressure and sort of people paying a little bit more attention to the stimulus politics, that there's going to be some independent leftward push, and Daniel and I are doing our small part, in this direction on the Democratic Party to like stand up for working class interests of the people, the voters it's supposed to represent, so that doesn't happen in the next round. But yeah, that was pretty disappointing.
Yeah, so maybe this is like the unheard of moment when we do a book talk when Thea and I disagree, so we can drive some narrative tension here. So one way of coping with the Bernie loss is to step back a little bit. I think the claim has been that 2020s would be the decade of the Green New Deal. I think that's still true. And I think step back, what do we see? I think Biden is neoliberalism's final facelift. You're not going to be able to do anymore. It will snap. Trump is something else. I don't have as good a zinger, but he's, I think, also the end of the line. He, as Thea said, and I think you're right to be worried about this, Sean, he got elected promising not to do Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security cuts. He has not been able to hold the line. 3 weeks ago, I would tell anybody listening, right-wing populism is going to destroy us all. But he is not, he lacks the coherency to drive that through. However, you go back behind Trump, and like you say, I'd think of a trio in the Republican Party: Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, and Marco Rubio. And Marco Rubio, people say different things about the man. I have no insight, but certainly his staff is putting out all these economic patriotism manufacturing platforms. The other thing is that Marco Rubio has finally learned about climate change, but only fortification. So I think my fear is that the eco-apartheid right-wing populist Republican Party platform is racist as fuck, obviously, is a lot around manufacturing, which won't create jobs, but nobody cares about that. But is essentially, I don't know how populist it will get, but some amount populist, and will offer to its working class, or I should say, to the kind of less educated, more working class, not less educated, but people who have fewer degrees of school, white working class voters, will offer them a fortress America. The fortress Europe landed in the United States. I don't think they'll offer them universal health care, but they will offer some substantial thing, I think. And I think that is the 2024 Republican pivot. I don't know if that eco-apartheid vision wins in 2024, I don't know. But Bernie didn't win this time, and yet they've won the future of the party. We have won the future of the party already. So I think that is right to be afraid of some form of eco-apartheid. How populist, I don't know. I think Thea's right. The business class is not necessarily lined up for it, but we should be very worried about it. We talk about this in the book as the fundamental thing that we're fighting against. And our fear has been that the young Mike Bloomberg, AKA Pete Buttigieg, would be, like Macron, a sort of gateway drug to the neo-fascist eco-apartheid right. Because of course, a centrist compromise that's just like carbon taxes, a few tax credits isn't gonna work. And so then that breaks apart, and the socialism or barbarism fork just comes sooner, which I think is what's happening this year. So I don't know, I guess my final comment about that is I think you are right to be afraid of that. And I think that we as socialists, the thing with the Biden administration is we can't get too fixated on what exactly it means, because we're still in a decade-long fight. And the last thing is our Greek Marxist friend Nikos Poulantzas has this line, which is that the state is a condensate of class struggle. And I think maybe I would popularize and maybe vulgarize and maybe bastardize it by saying the Biden administration will be defined by the balance of class forces that are able to mobilize around it. And so he will not be our Chavez, but if the left is strong enough, I think that will limit the damage. And what we're really fighting over is what comes after 2020, who's winning the primary elections, which movements are strongest, what is our vision for 2024? The decade of the Green New Deal is 10 years, and we're still only into year one. I think our enemy is the Republican neo-fascist right that will be fortress America, and our friends are, we're our friends. I will be talking about our ideas all night.
Okay, so I have more questions I could ask, but they're all even more depressing. So I want to turn it over to folks here. Does anybody have a question? If you do, raise your hand and I will turn your video on. I see some very awesome people on the chat, so I know you're thinking about something.
We want to just explain how to raise hand. If people don't know, it's you click on participants, right?
That's how you see it. I think you should have a raise hand button down at the bottom of the screen if you're a panelist. I mean, if you're a participant. If you can't figure it out, you can also just type something in the chat. Anybody? My old like teaching undergraduate instinct is like threatening to kick in, where I'm just gonna like call on somebody. So I don't know. Somebody wants to jump on. All right. Yuri, do you want me to put you on the video, or do you want to just have you just read the question off the chat?
Okay. People
All
might
right. So what can we start doing now to prepare for a Trump presidency? So all right, that's a depressing question. Another 4 more years. What's the Green New Deal program?
I mean, look, my position on the Trump presidency is that it is too depressing to prepare for, but I think for the most part, the things we would try to do to win should be the same. Like, in other words, build up our down ballot candidates, build up the labor unions, build up the community groups. I think I don't know, I kind of feel like this is maybe veering slightly off track, but the problem with disaster politics often is that you have this very intense moment of mutual aid that is very good, and then it doesn't last. Rebecca Solnit has a really great book, Paradise Built in Hell, but none of those case studies turned into socialism or anything like that. We can look at the case of Occupy Sandy, New York, that I looked at very closely when I was doing research there, and a lot of those people were my friends and comrades, and the infrastructure of Occupy Sandy actually played a really big role in the rise of Bernie. But again, I think our challenge is to do the mutual aid work we need to do to take care of ourselves, to prepare for Trump, but to turn that organizing, to make that organizing that something that can go on offense and really fight to win the election, fight to win the arguments, fight to win the agenda, fight to define politics in all of our different local contexts. So I don't think there's like a single magic bullet, but I guess I don't think there's anything that we would do to try to win at various scales that is going to detract from preparing for loss. So I would just say plan and fight to win for now.
Yeah, I agree completely. I basically think that any organizing that we do in the moment, whether it's pressuring Congress, whether it's mutual aid stuff, whether it's, other forms of extra parliamentary action, are good regardless of the outcome. I mean, they make the future outcome better regardless of what that future outcome is, right? So I don't think that we should backwards plan from a Trump presidency. We should just, forward plans from like the various types of goals that we want to achieve and outcomes that we want to avoid in terms of climate crisis. We've gotten this question, a variant of this question at a couple of different events that we've done. And one other thing I'll say, sort of adding to that, is that obviously if Trump wins, that affects our tactics. We don't 100% know how, because some of it depends on we have a very likely sort of divided government. Like, it depends on the situation in Congress, how bad things are, whether it's total GOP control or whether it's divided or not. Anyway, so there's still some nuance if Trump wins, but obviously if he wins, it's very bad. But we also do not stop organizing in that context. And I guess like a couple of things are just that if we can't expect that we're going to get federal action on keeping fossil fuels in the ground, for example, and not that we would expect that per se from Biden, but it would, he would be a little bit more open to pressure in that direction. But we certainly are not going to expect that from someone who loves to give handouts to the fossil fuel industry. So then we just think about organizing more direct action. We think about replicating Standing Rock all over the United States. I mean, we just have to literally do what we can to prevent more of this like deadly substance from being taken out of the ground, right? So we pivot more to certain forms of militant direct action. And we also think about, we try to leverage the fact that we live in a federal system, right? Again, I don't want to, it will be terrible to lose like the purchasing power of the federal government and the sort of weight of the federal government and the way that it can diffuse policy across the national territory. But But we also have some of the largest economies in the world, like within the United States, right? And we can definitely shape what happens subnationally. And California and New York have just, been amazing in terms of some of what they've achieved in those state legislatures in terms of changing the energy mix of those states, and also sort of getting those states into a direction of a just transition in terms of frontline communities and workers. And we just pivot to that subnational work. We put pressure on Congress, and we use direct action against the fossil fuel industry.
All right, so we have another question around the the origins of the Green New Deal, and pointing out that genesis of the Green New Deal was outside of the Democratic Party. The question mentioned Howie Hawkins, Green Party, pitching this as early as 2010. I know Ann Pettifor in the UK was using the phrase even before that. So maybe just some comments on kind of how this idea has evolved and how it's been taken up and what the different valences have been.
So to prove my generosity of spirit, here's Ann Pettifor's book, The Case for the Green New Deal. Everywhere I'm sitting, I have multiple Green New Deal books within arm's reach. I'm basically just like a lazy octopus of progress. The Green New Deal as a political platform really owes its origins to the Green Party, Jill Stein as well. The reason I held up the Ann Pettifor book is she actually gives a really nice genealogy of the back and forth use of the Green New Deal, and a bunch of leftists in the UK really pushed this idea. Edward Barbier wrote a book for the United Nations, which is actually not very good. I certainly don't recommend it. I think the thing I would emphasize is I think there are like 3 strains of organizing even before any of this stuff happened that are like, I like to say the Green New Deal stands on the shoulders of giants. And who are those giants? Like, one is the environmental justice movement, which from the 1980s arises from the recognition that by far the most polluted communities are Black and brown communities. Anybody in Baltimore knows, and this is blindingly obvious. There's been a bit of a war in the literature, but it turns out that even if you account for class, it is really racialized. And so this comes, as a result of this, a very long-standing idea that frontline communities, communities of color, indigenous communities should lead on this. The second is the just transition movement out of the labor movement. There's a very long, rich history, which I'm not going to get into now, but the labor movement for a very long time, including things like the Apollo Project, Blue-Green Alliance, and so on, have been trying to come up with ways for a worker-led transition where workers would not be, the workers would be bailed out in fossil fuel industries and related industries, but not their bosses. And then I think the last thing that we have to recognize is the struggles from below led by EJ movements in California, very successful, so that California's cap and trade program basically sucks. But one upshot of it is that there's some revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And 35% of that revenue has to be directly invested in frontline communities, Black, brown, heavily polluted, and or working class. There's some different screens. It adds up to 35%. That's been pretty successful. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars invested every year, everything from cash for clunkers to solar panel programs, you name it. And that's very, as I was saying earlier, I think one of the more original ideas of left climate politics in the last few years. So yeah, all that to say, it's right. We shouldn't fetishize AOC or the AOC marquee resolution or marquee. But I think we do recognize that that was like a kind of totemic political event. And it's a reference point, but certainly the history is long and is not in the roots of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and one other thing to add to that is that I think what's really exciting about the Green New Deal is precisely to use that fetishized word, is to like, if we can refrain from fetishizing specific labels, and obviously like there's a specific resonance to the New Deal or to the Marshall Plan or to things like that within the US or within the US kind of European circuit. But if we kind of just, put aside what the specific policy labels are and kind of think broadly around just transitions, around climate justice, around sort of public policies that are equitable and address the climate crisis at the same time, then I think there's a lot of really interesting transnational diffusion going on right now around like what those policies might look like, how they both are, rooted in local and national contexts and specific to those at the same time that because the climate crisis and capitalism are planetary, they necessarily have the sort of global dimension to them. And Daniel and I and our other co-authors have been involved in some interesting exchanges with folks in the UK. Daniel and I are also involved in similarly interesting exchanges with comrades in Latin America that are thinking through this in their national context, but also in a hemispheric kind of scale of like thinking about the way that the hemisphere, what the political economy of the hemisphere is, and like how we might think through what a just transition means, for example, for like a petro state like Mexico or Venezuela, and how we might think about the historic relationship between the U.S. and Latin America and the historic inequities and present inequities of that relationship as something that we need to organize around pretty explicitly as we confront the climate crisis. So I think, you know, whoever coined it is sort of one thing, and I, you know, genealogies are interesting, but I think what's more interesting is that like the policies themselves, because of their global character, because they're addressing global crises, lend themselves to this kind of transnational collaboration that I think is super fruitful.
Anybody else have a question on here? If not, I have one more. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Oh, I got a hand. All right, Sarah, I'm gonna make you a panelist so you can ask your question. Did that work? I've never tried this before. Hey, here it goes.
Hey, Sarah.
Oh, just a second. Okay, hi. I just had a question about, you know, Baltimore has like a ton of vacants, and like many cities. And I know, Daniel, your area is housing. I just was wondering, like, are there ways of organizing on the ground and trying to get like community ownership of the vacants in a way that transitions them into green housing? Do you have any kind of, can you speak to that at all?
Thank you, Sarah. That's such a great question. So I'm the luckiest person in the world because I got to go to Baltimore many months ago, and my good friend Nikki Fabricant, who teaches at Towson, showed me around a project on this exact issue. So my understanding is that in Baltimore, the United Workers is an incredible group, and they are leading a fight to transform vacant or not being used row houses, do green upgrades, and make them to community land trusts. So community land trust can be completely decentralized. I think before I really understood what a community land trust was, I assumed all the different houses would be contiguous, but that's not necessary. So the idea is that the homes, if I understand this campaign rightly, are retrofitted, brought up to kind of code, and ideally at a green standard. People can live in them, and then this housing is off the market essentially forever, and the land is governed by some kind of community group, which should be democratic. So I think this is actually really smart and really important, and I'm glad you brought this up. I live in Philly, and Philly, like Baltimore, is not, although there are gentrification pressures in Philly, but most of the city has actually been getting poorer, even in the last 20 years. So we talk often in markets like San Francisco and New York about certain kinds of housing policies that don't really apply to cities like Philly or Baltimore or Cleveland or you name it. So in Philly, we've got a candidate running for state senate, Nikhil Saval, and his proposal that I helped work on with some others is to convert 25,000 vacant row homes into into non-market housing through community land trust. We estimate 125,000 people could get this housing. It could cause no carbon emissions, be made very energy efficient. And I think another piece I want to bring is this kind of thing you're talking about, Sarah, also kickstarts the green building economy for the whole region, but from below. And you might say, oh, Daniel, that's so sweet. You know, we're going to use retrofits to affordable low-income housing to transform the entire green buildings industry. Who could possibly do that? Well, actually, that's called Energiesprong. It's an extremely successful green buildings program that comes out of Holland. And something that people have heard me say ad nauseum, if you've been listening, is like green retrofits of low-income housing and green production of low-income housing is this like where the architectural standard has shifted in Europe. Last year in Europe, the EU Mies van der Rohe Prize for architecture. Mies van der Rohe makes these very elegant modernist skyscrapers in the mid-century. The Mies van der Rohe Prize for architecture went for a retrofit of public housing in Bordeaux, France. And in the UK, the Sterling Prize for architecture, National Sterling Prize, went for new passive house standard social housing in Norris, England. And in Manchester, there's a public housing corporation now developing what they're calling luxury standard public housing, and also very environmental. So stuff is all great. So I think that, yes, focusing, we're in a housing crisis. We're gonna have a foreclosure crisis. I'm part of the Homes Guarantee campaign. Our demand is rent zero, no rent, no evictions, no utility costs, no mortgage payments, and not paying it back after either. Mom and pop landlords should get bailed out by the government, and the rest should just fucking eat it, and they're going to be fine. Blackstone is going to be absolutely fine. So will BlackRock, and so will the rest of them. So yeah, I think this is a great campaign, and I think that's actually how we're going to win the fundamental cultural struggle of our era, which is that when working class people and people of color hear the word green, what it means to them is make my life getting better, my community getting better for me, not Whole Foods got a new line of purple cauliflower. So yeah, let's win this fight. United Workers teaching the rest of the country how to win. It's beautiful.
Awesome.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing to that, which is
add on the context after Thea, please. I mean.
Oh yeah. You know, we can talk about this for longer, but yeah, I just want to note that, just going back to Yuri's question from before about like what can we do to prepare for a Trump presidency? Like, we're living under a Trump presidency, and it's amazing organizing is happening, right? And I think that the rent stuff and the utilities organizing, that around moratoria on utility payments and around the rent freeze stuff is like amazing, because it builds on like all this a long trajectory of tenants' rights organizing in working class black and brown neighborhoods. And Daniel, you know, already went through that. And so it's like building on pre-existing networks, but it's also being super agile about the moment that we're in and not getting scared by the crisis. Oh, we shouldn't make big demands because we're in a crisis moment. No, this is the moment that we make big demands. Or we shouldn't make demands because like the federal government doesn't care. Well, it doesn't matter. Like, we also live in municipalities and states that might start to implement some of these demands, and then they become part of like the political normal in the exact way that Daniel just said. So I think it's such a, you know, we have to kind of keep these examples in mind, you know, in the hopeful, you know, hopefully we're not in the case of a Trump presidency in a few years, but we are in one now. And like, it just shows that a lot of amazing organizing work can still happen, and organizing work that already has had some amazing impacts on public policy, on not just the public debate, but on actual public policies.
Sarah, is there something we should know about the United Workers and the row house CLT organizing going on in Baltimore?
I'm most familiar with United Workers for their zero waste plan work, but that's awesome to hear that they're really doing stuff with community land trust a lot too. I'm newer to that. Just been thinking about organizing tenants more because of our like mutual aid organizing we're doing in my neighborhood. We're trying to make that more lasting structure by having block captains and people who can start to like talk about vacants in their neighborhood and what to do about them. So it just came from thinking about that. I'd heard about community land trust, but I'm not that knowledgeable yet. So yeah, I just want to know how we can build people power to demand something, you know, like the best possible outcome for those vacants, which seems like, yeah, green housing, something stable rent. Well, I don't know if the community land trust, I guess, keeps keeps it affordable as well. So something like that.
Cool. I'll just add one note. This is that's super helpful, and the zero waste stuff is really important. A friend of mine in Philly is obsessed with the construction waste, and it turns out, of course, again, you know, we should not over celebrate European examples. There's a lot of shitty stuff happening in Europe, overwhelmingly. But it turns out there's a red-green governed suburb in France, which is, unfortunately, they're demolishing one of these gigantic social housing complexes, creating new social housing. I hope they're creating enough units. I don't know, but it's led by the left, so let's hope so. They're taking all the demolished stuff and reusing 90% of it. There's like a thriving, you know, including every cast iron radiator from those units is then going into other housing units in the rest of the city. So it is actually just like the most minimal care for like science and common sense could bring us like very far from where we are in the US right now. And I hope, yeah, we can link up the waste campaigns, the housing campaigns, the climate campaigns, and the work of laborers should all be lifted up. And it feels like so many issues and many of the projects we talk about in the book are so tantalizingly close. And it's like, we're just a little bit of power away from being able to make so much change.
Awesome.
Cool. Anybody else wanna hop on, ask a question?
I'll just let you know in case this doesn't come up that although my background is very blank, I'm wearing some appropriate clothing here. This is a little rose on my sweatshirt. And underneath I have my Green New Deal
What?
t-shirt. It's not just Green New Deal, it's Green New Deal, deal with it. So it's, that's the one thing. If Bernie had won, that would have been our line. You know, they'd be like, "Oh, all these centrist operatives are concerned about deal with it."
So the question is, where the hell did you get that? Because I think we're going to sell more of those T-shirts right now than we are books from the bookstore.
Oh yeah, that comes from the Creative Action Network. But actually, if you go to the Dream Defenders store, the Dream Defenders, incredible group in Florida, they have an incredible Green New Deal T-shirt that has the cannabis plant, a planet, Green New Deal, and lots of also really other good merch. Dream Defenders. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's another question. So I will ask my last question, and we'll see if anybody else has anything else to say. If not, I'll say good night. My question has to do with this kind of, Thea, you touched on this, and it's something that I felt as well, that international solidarity is at a real low point, right? Especially in U.S. social movements, we've lost that muscle. You know, what was like a really thriving kind of culture of international exchange and kind of orientation towards international movements from below to provide leadership is now, it's, you know, despite people's intentions, which I don't think are bad, it seems to have slipped. And I think it connects to the Green New Deal stuff in the way that, you know, there was actually I was listening to The Dig, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with, and Mike Davis was on it. He kind of talked about the threat of the left slipping into an America First, kind of a version of America First, right? That understood itself to be left-wing and progressive and radical, but was really not challenging the U.S. role in propping up this extractivist, you know, almost suicidal capitalist system. And I guess, you know, for me, that's a real worry. You know, I think about really good intentioned environmental groups who talk about, you know, the World War II scale, you know, style mobilization, right? And it's a mode of thinking about the way we win that centers the U.S. as a nation state and centers the project of a strong United States as a nation state and a world leader. And I wonder if the future actually looks quite a bit different. I wonder if actually we're not going to be the leaders in this. Right? I wonder if we are going to be the state that has to be challenged and contested and contained as this unfolds, right? If other people are going to get ahead of us and we're going to be the retrograde actor, you know, even maybe despite having like a Biden administration that's fighting tooth and nail to preserve the rights of the extractive fossil fuel companies that make up a huge bulwark of our bipartisan political class. And so I guess the question is, how do we rebuild the internationalist left, and how do we do that in a way that avoids the temptation to center the U.S. as the agent of global progress?
Yeah, I'm somewhat convinced, though my opinion on this kind of changes day to day, but today I'm convinced that we live in a non-polar world. I'm very open to ideas that, you know, the US is still a hegemon in sort of military terms, but I think in so many other ways, the US is not exercising hegemonic power in the sort of proper sense of that term. But it's also not clear to me that there's another country or government that is, right? So that's a sort of non-polar rather than multipolar kind of idea. But that could change, and I think that China, you know, certainly is the obvious place that comes to mind. Europe, the European project seems in sort of disarray. I mean, they finally got together a stimulus thing, but you know, there's so much political discord within Europe over the very notion of Europe that it's not clear that Europe could sort of be the hegemon. Anyway, we could discuss this at length, but I agree with the sort of assumption of the question. And then on the sort of internationalism piece, I mean, I said this earlier, but I'll just expand on it a little bit more now, which is that, you know, my prior experiences on the left, or sort of my formative experiences, I should say, on the left, like in the past decade or two, were in the solidarity movement in terms of Latin American solidarity, the anti-war movement, and the sort of alter or anti-globalization movement, all of which were like explicitly internationalist. They were like literally about the international, the global, and the transnational, and explicitly centered on solidarity and with explicit awareness to the US's kind of undue, undeserved power in the world, and trying to contain that from within and from below, rather than in these other ways that it might be contained, which is by other hegemonic states containing us. So, you know, those were my formative experiences, and probably those, you know, of other folks on in this event. But since then, I feel like we have not attended as much to internationalism. I will just name a couple of exceptions to that, because I think I was a little too quick and easy with that characterization of the left. And I forget where it was, but someone else made this point recently. If I can remember, I will cite them. But I think, you know, when we talk about the U.S. left, it's obviously not a monolith. And some of the movements that are explicitly, it was Mike Davis on a recent interview on The Dig, kind of made the point that I'm about to make. But I think that the sort of more internationalist sectors of the US left right now are the migrant justice movement, which is an inherently internationalist kind of, you know, it's about the movement of people across borders and also about the inequities and violence of those borders in the first place. So the whole immigrant rights movement, migrant justice, day laborers, all of those kind of organizing spaces are explicitly internationalist, and do not make appeals to on the basis of like American greatness, though sometimes they may make appeals to like America not living up to its promise. Right, but I think that's different than like saying that the U.S. should be first or hegemonic, of course. So migrant justice, Black Lives Matter had a very explicit internationalism in terms of both like the diagnosis of anti-Blackness as a sort of global phenomenon, of racial capitalism as a global phenomenon, but also in terms of their alliances and a lot of work with Palestinian groups and sort of, you know, a lot of transnational solidarity work. And then kind of relatedly is Standing Rock, which had a explicitly, again, internationalist or anti-nationalist or, you know, whatever, you know, sort of obviously like coming from a very deep critique of like US empire and the way that empire is also always an internal empire, and also forged a lot of amazing alliances with Palestinian rights groups, with Black Lives Matter, with indigenous movements in Latin America. And so I think those three are sort of interesting pillars to think about like what an internationalist left might look like, and thinking about sort of amplifying and integrating those demands more broadly. But you know, as someone who's like a proud and super active DSA member, I don't think that we do enough on the internationalist front, though we do have an internationalist committee that is doing, you know, trying to change that. But I think that the sort of socialist left, explicitly sort of socialist left, could think more internationally and organize more internationally.
I would just say, I just pasted a link in here to something. I think that the Green New Deal can be, and certainly in the vision that Thea and I propose, substantively internationalist, even when it's implicit. And what do I mean by that? So I was talking before about this imperative of dematerializing prosperity. If the US version of decarbonizing is simply swapping fossil fuels for clean energy and everything else staying the same, then we are posing a huge problem for the world. I mean, replacing every one of our gas cars with electric car or like electric SUV is a disaster. I mean, it's an absolute disaster. It will require vast numbers of minerals. And building enough wind turbines and solar panels to satisfy our current energy needs. Americans use per capita twice as much energy as Europeans, twice as much. And they definitely live better. So okay, let's see, there are elements of the Green New Deal, I think, that are happening. So the Green New Deal for Transportation, this project, not particularly socialist, good project. My friend Billy Fleming was lead author. They find polling support for a policy they advocate, a fix it first mandate for infrastructure. Before you build any new highway infrastructure, you fix what we have. I mean, the roads and bridges are crumbling. The answer isn't to build more roads, it's to fix the roads, build up more light rail, electric buses, you name it. So on a whole series of fronts, whether it's housing, transportation, energy system, I think the US is being implicitly internationalist when it's every time it's choosing a less resource intensive path. We could also talk, of course, about trade agreements. Thea and I pulled that in the link that I posted earlier, Green Industrial Policy. But so I guess like, I agree with everything Thea said. I agree with the premise of the question. Like we have to do better at being internationalism, but I also think we can't underrate just the importance of seizing power domestically. If we say that America will lead on energy efficiency, it might be like a bit chauvinistic, but I think that's okay to say, as long as we're sharing the technology. So, I mean, I don't think it's a fine line. I think we just need more internationalism, but I do think we shouldn't understate the importance to the world of the US becoming like a low carbon leader, and in particular, a leftish one. When Thea and I released our green stimulus plan, one of the leaders of the housing movement in Sao Paulo messaged me, and she had passed it on to some state reps for the Workers' Party, and they were very excited about it. I mean, I think for them, for the housing movement in Sao Paulo, which I spend a lot of time working with, they see Bernie Sanders as like an incredibly positive development for Latin America. And now he won't be president, but you know, just the global potential of that. And I don't know if we'll want to answer this separately, this question about China, but that's, I guess, the last thing I would say. Like, China is a leader in many ways on environmental issues. They're also financing coal plants around the world, this Belt and Road strategy that's super resource intensive. And like a DSA internationalist chapter doesn't have the same weight as if we have socialists in the government saying, listen, we're decarbonizing our economy, now we have to work together. But yes, internationalism and the migrant rights point is dead on. And that's an enormous challenge for the US left, no matter what happens, to do better. John, you're on mute.
All right. Sorry about that. Nobody is, I don't see any hands, so I'm going to wrap this up. One of my favorite things about doing book events in person, unlike this kind of setup, is really just being able to show appreciation for speakers and to really make them, understand that their work as authors, as thinkers, as advocates, as activists is really highly valued. And it's awkward to do that on a Zoom chat. But I hope everybody at home can join me in ridiculously clapping their hands to an empty room and thanking Thea and Daniel, and by extension their co-authors for the book they've written, which I hope you will all buy from redms.org. The link is up at the top of the chat. But also just for their work in general, which I think is really inspiring and really smart and really needed. And Daniel and Thea, thank you so much for spending the evening with us to chat.
Thank you so much. This is awesome.
Can I just say, when I visited Red Emma's in person, it was one of the most beautiful left-wing spaces I'd ever encountered in the world. I mean, it's a co-op restaurant, co-op bookstore, known around the country as a dream destination for left-wing person to go hang out, talk, meet other people. And now you've brought it online, and it remains a beautiful, beautiful left-wing project that can only inspire us. I feel very, very grateful to get to partake in this. First online thing with Red Emma's. I feel like I'm gonna wear that on a button until it falls off.
All right. Take care, everybody, and hope to see all of you in person sooner rather than later.
Likewise.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Right.